G'day guys, welcome again to Lessons from the Legends. This time we're going over a guy who a lot of people put as the greatest boxer of all time. I don't, but I think he's in the top three. Not even Mount Rushmore, he's on the podium. I just don't know exactly what order, whether he's second best or third best, but for me, the Boston Terror, great nickname by the way, Sam Langford. One of the great giant killers of all time, one of the greatest knockout artists of all time. He was a guy who started at lightweight, albeit very young and very big lightweight, and then sort of moved his way up. Kind of settled in at, I think, a natural heavyweight, although he was quite happy to have be a bit chubby. So he fought usually at around the light heavyweight and often just into the heavyweight range. But he didn't care about weight cutting. He didn't care about keeping himself super lean because he knew that he could beat and knock out everyone from middleweight to heavyweight. And Lord knows there were a lot of great challengers back in the day. This was a bit of a golden era of a bunch of great African American heavyweights who came together and all fought each other a lot. If you've heard the Four Kings from the 1980s with Duran, Leonard, Hearns and Hagler, they sort of had a little bit of an earlier rendition of this when Sam Langford had sort of gone through the lightweight, welterweight and gotten himself a bit bigger. And this kind of an early Four Kings kind of came about with him and a couple of three other sort of natural heavyweights who were naturally sort of bigger than him in Joe Jeanette, Sam McVeigh, and Harry Wills. And he had a series of amazing fights with these guys. Eventually, Harry Wills came along a little bit after the other three, and he would go on to be, the top African American sort of heavyweight from the 1910s or the mid 1910s and into the early 20s. But he fought Sam a lot of times. Technically it's 17 times, although a handful of the fights were staged, just so these guys could get a bit of an easier sort of paycheck, because being African American boxers, they weren't getting paid as much as the white boxers, even though they were very, very good and arguably better than the white boxers at the time. But he did get two knockouts over Harry Wills in two of the most impressive single performances of all time. Both times he was behind on points, but he knocked out the much bigger and very good heavyweight in Harry Wills, who was quite a big man at the time. He was about 6'3", but especially had a really long reach. And that was a big, big thing that kind of separated Harry Wills. He had a huge reach, but Sam still managed to get in, cut the distance, and close the distance and get on the inside. Sam, before we get off it, he also fought guys who we've already talked about in the early stage of his career. He fought Joe Gans and Barbados Joe Walcott very early in his career when he was a bit smaller and younger, and certainly had very close fights with them, and that's kind of two of the fights which really put him on the map before he went on to become one of the, in my opinion, three greatest boxers of all time. How did he do it though? How did he manage to close the distance against these bigger guys as we go into his peak career when he took on guys like the best heavyweights in the world? So let's dig into it and see how he did it. So one way you can do it is countering. It is much easier to land through countering your opponent after they have initiated a punch and thrown a punch at you than it is to throw that first punch when your opponent's ready for it and they're ready just to step out of the way. What you'll find with boxing when you start sparring, if you haven't already, is that it's impossible to touch people let alone punching them. Just glancing your 16-ounce glove against their forehead and barely wiping the sweat off their forehead is very difficult. So it's so hard to hit people. What you really have to do is get comfortable being in the pocket, which means being in punching range with them. And the way to do this first is to allow them to throw first, allow them to initiate, and then counter their punch. Especially if you have shorter arms and shorter reach and you're shorter than your opponent, which we've talked about a few guys like this, obviously, as we're going through the greatest pound-for-pound boxers in history. So Sam Langford is one of those. And Sam he was lethal with all of his punches. He had a great right hand, phenomenal hooks, great uppercuts, and a fantastic jab. And typically, if a taller guy is fighting a shorter guy, he will just try and keep them arranged with his jab as much as possible. It is the weapon that is already closest to the opponent. It's the weapon that is the quickest to throw. So it is the one that is the safest one to try and keep your opponent at bay. And what Sam would do when people would throw their, let's say Harry Wills for an example, which ended up being arguably his greatest opponent with, I think, his two most impressive wins in his career. Two of the greatest wins anyone's ever had in boxing was Sam Langford knocking out this much bigger, great heavyweight in Harry Wills. Was when Wills would throw the jab, Langford would then slip off to the side and throw his own jab at the same time. And just to be safe, he'd use this right hand to parry the jab. So if the jab's coming this way from their left hand, you can use this right hand here that is sort of right at your cheek. You can slap it to the side. You can move your head to the side as well. So now the jab goes through there. Now their fist goes past your head. Now you can get in close. And Sam Langford, with his quick footwork, he'd step inside at the same time. And then as he would do it, throw the jab straight through as well. That is the way to sort of counter your opponent and get on the inside and stun them. Once he had them stunned, then he could throw his power punches, and he had a lot of power despite being usually the smaller guy in the ring. So that was the key. It was this kind of like slip to the outside of the jab, slip to the outside of the jab, and throwing the jab back at the same time. And once you can sort of time it simultaneously, it works really well as the first counter to put into your game, because typically the jab is going to be the punch that's thrown at you the most. And this is just the most bulk standard, like simplest, quickest, most effective way to counter the jab. If you are not necessarily looking for the knockout, there are ways to counter the jab which are a little bit riskier. They won't hit as much, but they will get you more knockouts. This one though, it's great just to land, and you can land, break their nose, easy done. Like, it's a very, very good counter. It's the first counter that everyone should learn, either the jab to the head or the jab to the body at the same time as well. But that's sort of like with that sort of bladed stance, if your opponent is in the same stance as you, so they're mirroring you, they also have their left foot forward and you have your left foot forward, that slip to the right, parry with the right, and slipping through with the jab at the same time as they're throwing theirs is the best counter to start off with your boxing career with. Get used to this and you'll suddenly find that guys will try to, that's their first option. It's like, okay, the safest option is just land the jab, land the jab, land the jab. And if they can't even land the jab without you jabbing them back immediately, life gets very, very difficult for them. So, lesson from, in my opinion, one of the three greatest boxers who has ever lived, Sam Langford, is the slip to the outside, simultaneous jab counter, I guess would be the word for it. But drilling this into your game is definitely the first great counter you can learn. And I think as you start your sparring journey, if you do nothing else in your first round of sparring, just try and do this. And it will frustrate your opponent greatly and lead you on the roll of a lot of success later on, where you can then close that distance, stun them, and get into range where you can start throwing with your left hooks and your right hand and more power punches, which Sam was also amazing at as well. As he recorded, I believe, the most knockouts of any professional boxer in history. So just a random stat there for you. And his quality of opposition was very, very high as well. So yeah, one of the greatest knockout punchers in history, and based on that metric, the greatest knockout puncher in history. I think that's a pretty, if I had to say anyone, he's probably the guy. So I hope you enjoyed that, guys. Phenomenal boxer, definitely worth looking up if you have plenty of time, because he has a very long career with a lot of big fights against huge name opponents. Sam Langford, the Boston Terror, and the slip to the outside simultaneous jab counter. Best way to start your boxing journey once you get in there and start sparring with your opponents, in my opinion.